My name is Dan Chisholm. I'm a health systems advisor and a health economist in the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse at WHO. So I'm here not least to show solidarity to my friend Jessica, who was the architect of this report and event. We're working together through this thing called the Mental Health Innovation Network, which is also at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So I think the question which Jess had said that might come my way was around the stats, around some of these figures that have come up. In the case of the lost productivity, this is actually I have Jessica to thank for this, because we're working on this this economic case, the return on investment case, for this recent meeting co-hosted by the World Bank and WHO in last month. So we thought we'd better turn up with some stats. So we worked on this return on investment case. So that was really more looking at what happens if you actually scale up interventions. What will it cost, and what will you get back in terms of health gain, restored productivity? But Jess will say, well, what about if you don't do anything? What's the actual sort of burden? And there are these kind of estimates out there, but we had another go at this. And so just to give a sort of sense of how you can arrive at these numbers, Alistair, let's take Zimbabwe. Okay, so Zimbabwe has a population of about 15 million people, of which X%, let's say 5% of that population, suffer from depression in the adult population. And out of that population, how many of those are working? So let us assume half. Okay. Out of those people who are working in the adults of the working population age, how many days out of role or how many days lost are they going to face on average? And we have WHO and other international surveys to inform us about that, and it's alarmingly high. I mean, it's more than 20 days, up to 30 days a year out of role is the kind of average that we see. So you multiply all of that together, and you come up with 11.25 million. I just did it. 11.25 million lost days in Zimbabwe, and then you can also express that in terms of lost years. I've come up with this 50 million years.
Well,
you can also
put a. They don't even have a word for depression.
Pardon?
He just said they don't have a word for depression. How do you know that?
We are using the best estimates of the prevalence of depression and anxiety from the Global Burden of Disease study. Okay. Which is using, again, a validated survey methodology, which does all of this adaptation of the terminology and so on. So you can convert that into years of lost work. You can also convert it into dollars, of course, by taking the average sort of worth of a worker. And in fact, if you sort of multiply all that up across the world, we came up with this value of $1.1 trillion lost productivity per year. So that's an example of how we that sounds rather back of the envelope. In the return on investment analysis, that obviously is rather more involved, because you're trying to look at the influence of these disorders on the actual output of the economies. It's rather more sophisticated. But the bottom line message that we were transmitting at this meeting, so you're talking about the 1 in 4, which is the lifetime chance of someone experiencing an event. You can turn that around and say, well, for every $1 that you spend in scaling up for these disorders, you'll get back $4 in improved health and restored productivity. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dan. Look, what I'd like to do now, there are 3 other, as it were, planted questions or contributions that I will come back to, but I do want to throw it open just if there are a couple of people I can see really burning to. Yes. So we'll start over this side.
Hi. It's interesting that I'm Kohinoor Chowdhury. I work for YCare International. We work through the global YMCA movement to support the most marginalised young people around the world. The smoking example, I often use that example as well. And the figures that the gentleman just gave now, I'm sure ASH, the campaigning group that wanted to ban smoking, they took about 20 years to achieve that. And I want to know, and I'm sure they had those sort of figures all along. What I want to know is, most of us in this room, we work for organisations that are funded by other bodies, and they need to see results within 2 to 3 years. So what advice do you have for us to be able to convince donors that we won't be able to change policies in 2 to 3 years' time? It's going to take time. So how can we convince donors to fund us?
Okay. I'm going to take just two more on this side. The person right behind you. And please remember to say who you are.
Sure. Hi, I'm Kizzy from the Behavioural Insights team. I just had a question. There's some people suggest that depression is contagious and that depression is cultural, and that Western notions that life should be a bed of roses is not all that helpful, because life does have ups and downs and creates this just creates a market for pharmaceutical companies to sell us more drugs. And there's some suggestion that medicalising depression reduces people's resilience to deal with other issues in life, and it can just be effective. Medicalisation of it can be effective because it's a placebo effect, and that just suggests that we like being cared for and looked after by other people. So I just wondered, with this report, how does it sort of safeguard populations from over medicalising depression, which just creates profits for big pharma? Like, what are the features of this campaign that can ensure that actually people are going to get the right kind of treatment?
Great, thanks. And I'll take just one right at the back. I can see the hand, but not the face behind it. But
I'm very short. I can't. Okay. I was a teacher. When science began to advance the last century, science became a compulsory subject at schools. Now, I want to see if there is any educator on that top table over there. When we have problems at school, we call a psychologist, sociologist to deal with the children or their families. Why don't we teach psychology and sociology as a compulsory subjects in schools? I have been writing to social scientists for a very long time, and nobody has answered that. When we have problems, only you call the psychologist.
Okay.
Why don't you have psychology as a compulsory subject
Very good.
at schools?
Thank you very much. So, look, I want to just put, I will come back to you in a second, but there's some quite wide-ranging questions there. So there was one, I thought a really good one on the comparative campaigning question.
Yeah.
The trajectory of successful campaigns is very variable, and and I guess here we're talking about an issue which is a global campaign, is just about getting off the ground. The debt campaign took 10 years or whatever. So, I mean, it'd be interesting just to get your take on that particular issue.
Well, I think you have to. I think you've set the answer for your own question in a way. You have to be long term about it. You have to have good examples of other campaigns that have worked. You have to persuade them to step aside from the kind of day-to-day noise that too many people get caught up in. So I suppose if you talk about donors, I mean, donors in the main, whether they're governments, they're philanthropists, they're outside bodies, you've got to kind of appeal to their sense of being a bit special. And I think today, there's a wonderful, how many Arsenal supporters in here?
Actually, they're banned from the building.
Oh, fair enough. Well, the one's got in because he's already put his hand up. There are Arsenal supporters in most talks I do, and there's a wonderful. I'm a Burnley fan, right? And we'll beat Arsenal next year in the Premier League. But there's a wonderful quote from Arsene Wenger, the manager of Arsenal, in my last book. I talked to him about winning, and I didn't expect him to come up with this sort of genius insight. I think it is genius. He said, we've gone from a vertical world to a horizontal world. In a vertical world, leaders were able to make decisions, set out priorities, do what they did, and then they would work its way through the system. So in this case, building a team, prime minister governing a country, whatever it might be. He said in the horizontal world, where we're surrounded by 24/7 media, social media, and what have you, we're just bombarded by things that, if we're not careful, require our attention there and then, now. And if we're even less careful, make us change what we think we should do. So you have to persuade people that if they are interested in changing the world, they have to understand that change, but they have to remain more vertical than horizontal. In other words, they have to have their own sense of strategy, and part of your job is to keep them on their strategic track. Don't let them get distracted. Don't let them get overstressed by the fact that something's not happening immediately. And so, it's difficult because a lot of people in politics get very driven by the short term sometimes when they shouldn't be. What Wenger's basically saying is that the response to the short term pressures should be to be more long term. So that's what I think you have to do.
Yeah, which is a sort of tactical adaptation within the broader strategy, in a way.
Yeah.
Maybe just something
Please.
a little bit to add. Just to add to what Alistair said, I mean, this is one of the big problems we've been facing in development as a whole. Donors give money, within 2 years they want results. You know what this leads to? Verticalization of that program. You go, irrespective of what, you go and try and pursue and make quick results. Your burnout rate, you show you can do it, so that the funds will continue to flow. We're in the world of integration now. If you want to solve that problem so that it can stay on, then you need to integrate. Let's say you want to address the problem of malnutrition. You can either decide to, just go and, direct and treat the cases that are occurring, but then you know what? More and more cases will continue to occur. So whilst you're solving the direct cases, you need to go to agriculture, you need to go to social welfare, you need to go to education and bring everybody on board so that everybody understands. When you do that, it becomes sustainable. Then it becomes value for money. If you do quick fix, they are not sustainable. If you take your time, which is so many years, you do something that can stay, is sustainable, many people put hands on board and they do it, it becomes sustainable, then it becomes value for money. Nobody wants to throw money into the ditch. You put so much millions today, you want to show that after so many years, you can still see your results. That's the argument.
Jessica, did you want to come in on this?
I would actually, if
Please.
it's all right. I've got answers for all three actually. Great question.
Well, maybe don't do all three of
I'll
them,
do
but
the first.
do one of them. Yeah.
I thought that was an excellent question about how do we get donors on board when this takes such a long time and they want quick results. I think the key answer to that is that's why the SDGs are so important and that's why they exist, because they take into account this 15-year development agenda which has a long-term horizon. And they're built for issues like this. Health system strengthening, you can't do overnight. And there was a huge demand from the development community and from developing countries in terms of making sure that these were created. And so I think that's really the hook here, because we know that mental health is not going to be a quick fix overnight. But what's very interesting is the almost venture capitalist approach that's being taken by Grand Challenges Canada, where they provide seed funding through the Mental Health Innovation Network to over 70 projects around the world. It's similar to what the Global Innovation Fund does. They are allowed to have startup funding, and when they start to demonstrate results, then they get scaled up as well. And that allows for a wide range of things to be tried and tested. And I think donors really respond to what works. They need to see pilots and they need to see evidence and have this sort of accountability-driven investment. They want to know the M&E is strong. And that's where initiatives like the Mental Health Innovation Network provide that fantastic base.
And Dixon, there was another, I think, really important question that I don't want to lose, and it's it's a controversial area globally in this country, and I'm sure in Zimbabwe as well. But this debate about the over-medicalization of the mental health area.
So that's a very good question indeed. I think most people immediately conclude that when we use the word medicalization, we're talking about drugs, use of antidepressants or antipsychotics, whatever it is. But if you look at the research out there, there's a lot of evidence showing that you can treat most of these conditions without medication, but you still need structured talk therapy. You still need CBT. You need to be trained on how to do it. It has to be done in a certain way. And for that to happen, you obviously have to be looking at a set of symptoms that you work with. So I think it's, yes, that the drug companies have played their fair share in terms of making money out of these conditions, particularly in America, and that's why you now have a completely different approach to how you actually diagnose these conditions. We're doing away with the DSM-4, DSM-5. There's more emphasis on RDoC, which looks at things differently. So I think all of that is being taken into consideration. Yeah.
Can I just say something?
Please answer.
When I was first sort of diagnosed with depression, I was really, really resistant to medication. I didn't want to take it. And whenever I was on medication, I wanted to get off it. And I sort of do feel now, I'm now on medication all the time, and I'm kind of glad that I am. And I sort of feel I lost quite a few years because I was so resistant to medication. So I think it's a really tricky one. And I mean, I do think the pharmaceutical industry has got a kind of, you talk about strategy, I think we've got a massive strategic, the fact that, again, most of us require medication for something at some time, and yet they've got a very bad profile and a very bad kind of reputation. And I worry that it sort of puts people off sometimes getting the help that they need.
Mm.
Yeah, it certainly does.
I think an anti-medication message. Yeah, and that might be, that might be me.
Use the microphone, so just so people, because we have a big online
I was
audience.
just saying the placebo effect has been shown to be really powerful as well. And I mean, maybe it just suggests there's something about needing to be cared for, and people, they feel like someone's looking after them when they give them a pill, and that's all they need, or have CBT or something else. But I do worry that we're just creating profit for.
Yeah, but also the point that Dixon made earlier about, when he said, one psychiatrist for every 1 million people, how do you even begin to think about talking therapies for? I don't know where to start. So I can see why those nurses that I saw in Ghana are just right. Well, this is the medication we've got. Let's just give it to people.
Yeah. On the campaigning point, one of the things I've been very struck by, I think the way we think about campaigns, that social media has really had transformative effects. And if you think about India and the issue of violence against women, which is a very, very long-standing issue, which 3 years ago just erupted because of a couple of very specific incidents, which happen every day all over India, but somehow they really sort of captured the public consciousness. And I think the interesting outcome of that is that groups who'd been working on this for a long time were able to adapt very quickly and to drive through legislation and to sort of link it to their sort of broader strategies. And I guess it's the point that Alice is making as well, that you can't just be driven by the immediate. You have to be strategically positioned to take advantage of these opportunities when they arise. I'm afraid now I need to go to two of the planted.
Psychology one.
Sorry?
Psychology in schools.
Oh.
The school question.
I was going to come back to that.
Sorry.
Actually. I was going to come back to that. So I just wanted to call on Valentina Lemmy. Sorry, Valentina, please.
Hi.
Do say who you are as well.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Valentina Yami. I'm a research officer at the London School of Economics. So I would like to thank enormously for this report. It's thrilling and is one of a kind. It's probably the first highlighting the issue of funding for mental health. And I would like also to draw a little bit of attention on one of the matters that I think is crucial on funding. And I think it has been overlooked for so many times, and I'm very glad that Mr. Lai mentioned it. It's about the multiple impact on mental health. So we do know that mental health has an impact in many dimensions of people's life. And it does have impact in many sectors. We do know that we have interventions that are working, not only on health, but they are working on the other sectors. Yet, the focus so far has been on health. And many funders that have been funding mental health have been funding mental health from the healthcare side. So I do have two questions open to all speakers. So what do you think would help the understanding of those multiple impact? Mr. Chibanda mentioned the vocabulary used. Mr. Lai mentioned to take on board the different sector, agriculture, employment. And what will need to be done in order for them to take action, to the different sector to take action. And this is much more linked to Mr. Campbell's point on the social change that is driving the political change after. And the second question is more about, it's also linked to this multiple impact, but from a different angle. So what do you think would help funder in one sector? Because we do know that different funders have different priorities. What do you think would bring them to fund something that would have benefit from another sector, which is something that might be common in mental health? So, for example, some funding put into healthcare may have impact on employment.
So multiple benefits.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Both very good questions. And I also wanted to call on Harry Minus.
Thank you. My name's Harry Minnis. I'm from the University of Melbourne, from the Global and Cultural Mental Health Unit. My question is to Alistair about strategy. Arsene Wenger's comment about vertical and horizontal worlds, he could have been talking about the MDGs and the move to the SDGs. And I think one of the things that, that moving to that horizontal approach, and the point that has been made a couple of times about integration, seems to me to introduce some real strategic complexities. It used to be enough to persuade a Minister of Health to pay more attention to mental health services, but that's no longer so. It's necessary to also engage Ministries of Social Affairs, Ministry of Justice or Corrections, Ministries of Education, and so on. And so the bar needs to be lifted, it seems to me. It needs to be Prime Ministers and Ministers of Finance who are the real target of strategic efforts. So I wonder what you would have to say about how we can change our approach and move away from just a focus on the health sector.
Great. Actually, those questions are very closely related, as a matter of fact, because arguably unlocking that door is the key to doing what you're describing. But Alistair, do you want to have a first shot of that?
I mean, I disagree with what Dixon said earlier when he said that this can all be done kind of community up, and that you don't necessarily need figures of leadership who are, you know, I mean, you mentioned Mandela. I actually think what Mandela said at that time, I think it did have an impact. And I think that I even think sometimes when you get these sort of, we've had a couple in our media here recently where public figures that people didn't know were struggling with their mental health who come out and then who sort of talk about the lack of quality of service they got. I think it has an impact. I mentioned the Royals. I think that is potentially having an impact. And I think you're absolutely right that it's... I don't think I agree with you that actually there was ever a time where you just needed the health minister. Because, yes, you could persuade the health minister, but then the health minister, if it involves money, has to persuade the finance minister, and the finance minister has to persuade the prime minister. So we should definitely be pitching this at the top level of all governments. And, in a sense, demanding that they do what the best are doing. And I think, again, you know, I mentioned earlier how people tend to sort of get sucked into their own silos. There are some prime ministers, there are some finance ministers, there are some health ministers who are better than others. And we should be picking on the ones who are really, really good. And so let's say, for example, that I don't know what Malcolm Turnbull's like on this, but let's say that he's not very good. I'm just guessing, right? I think actually for you in your public challenges and the rest of it, actually be saying, do you know what, it's really, this guy presents himself in this way, but you know, there's David Cameron, a right-wing Conservative MP in the UK, he does a lot more on this than our Prime Minister, and that sort of thing then begins to kind of to have an impact. And I think you're absolutely right, and I don't think we should be scared by the fact that we want to be seeing this as being embedded into all government ministries and all government departments. We should welcome that. We were talking earlier about yesterday in the Queen's speech, the thing about prisons reform. And it's really interesting because Dixon made the point that he sort of got the feeling that David Cameron's heart wasn't quite in it. That's just a sense that he had. But I was saying, well, actually, I think Michael Gove, I think his heart is in it, the Justice Minister. And so when that happens, we like to think that personality and politics can be kept apart. They can't. They can't. You're talking about human beings, and some of them care about some things more than others. But you have to get into them at every level with your argument and make sure your argument's sustained over time. That, to me, is what strategy is. It's us saying, we want to achieve a really big thing. We can't do it on our own. We have to have governments. Within each government, there are some people who care more than others. We have to know how to get to them and how to persuade them. And it's complicated, but the insight you've got there, the mindset you've got there is absolutely spot on. It's the only way it's going to work.
And I
can't wait to tell Wenger that he's gone from MDGs to SDGs. He's going to be really, he's really going to chuffed by that.
I'd say Arsenal Football Club have never had such a good press in this particular building, but there we go. It does strike me, actually, that's a great discipline to apply for what we're thinking about here, because if you ask the question, if you had 5 minutes with the Prime Minister to make the case that this is in our national interest to do this, and by not doing it, we're undermining the national interest, and what are the arguments and the evidence that would swing that?
Don't even think about it in 5 minutes. If you could write a postcard, if you could have 20 seconds in a corridor, and the number of times I've seen people go in to see ministers and prime ministers and they have not thought through. They've got all the facts, they've got all they're convinced. How can this guy's an intelligent bloke, he's a prime minister, how can he not agree with me? They never think, what's the one thing I'm trying to get him to do?
Yeah. Actually, I'll come back to that. Can I ask you just to take up this question, because you hinted at it actually, on thinking about integration and how we kept this idea of multiple benefits. And actually, you gave the example of the committee that you've been arguing for in Sierra Leone, but maybe talk about some of the barriers that you've been facing in getting that idea taken up.
Well, frankly, just to open it up a little bit. For example, in trying to tackle this whole issue of mental health problems in society, I went to Liberia and I was taken around and we went to the police were going through a training of how to handle people that they bring to the police station. Imagine they bring a mental case or a depressed person or something to the police, and this depressed person or somebody with some mental is causing a whole lot of problem in the police station, and the police don't understand that this guy is mental, and they kick him and all of this. So the police were trained to be able to understand that some of the cases that come before them are mental cases, and therefore they need to pull back a little bit and understand how to handle with this guy. There's also the case of the prison. There are prisoners who get into trouble because they have mental problems. But until and unless you know that this guy is suffering or this person is suffering from mental problem, you will not understand how to deal with it. So if you want to address holistically, then you need to involve the police, you need to involve the prison authorities, and schools also. There are truant boys in schools, who have coming from broken homes, broken families, who are depressed at home, and they are sitting in class and causing all kinds of problems. So if you want to address it holistically, then you want to involve all of this, give them the requisite training as to how to identify somebody who has mental problems in their institutions so that they can be able to know how to go ahead with it. Now, the whole issue of integration, I have one small example. The UN set up what they call scaling up nutrition. The first thing they did, the target is the president or the vice president. That's where they will put the secretariat so that it becomes an issue, at the highest policy level. And then they involved all the other sectors. The Ministry of Finance chairs a committee, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Social Welfare, Ministry of Agriculture. It becomes everybody's business. So you begin to look at it holistically rather than just a health problem. You know, so that's just what I wanted to add to it.
Actually, Dixon, I wanted you, if you would, just to address that education question, because you know there's the issue of the cost of not acting, which partly manifests themselves in classroom. But in terms of the way that people come to understand the mental health problem, school is an opportunity to have that discussion. Does that happen in Zimbabwe?
So thank you very much. That's a very important question, actually, because if we treat the young early, we avert later onset of a wide range of these mental, neurological, and substance use disorders. So most countries in sub-Saharan Africa have what you call a school psychological services, but it's pretty much aimed at identifying people with mental retardation, so it's extremely limited. And as I was saying earlier on, I think the key is to work in communities and to empower those communities to be able to identify people in need. That includes the teachers as well. And so introducing psychological services that have specific screening strategies, in schools is quite important. So I do agree with that point. And in Zimbabwe, we are kind of trying to do that, but through the Friendship Bench, which is an initiative that I mentioned earlier on. And I'd like to also indicate that we're very fortunate that the Grand Challenges Canada, which is funded by the Canadian government, has been supporting the Friendship Bench for the past 6 years. And so we are trying to get into schools at the moment because we see that as an important area to cover.
Okay, so I'm going to throw it open to questions again. So I'm going to move towards the centre, not politically, but geographically.
Hello, I'm Kate Horsted from Age International. So we've talked about schools and ensuring younger people are included in education about mental health. 15% of people aged over 60 are living with mental health disorders. The prevalence of dementia is rising rapidly in both developing and developed countries, and depression in older people continues to go undiagnosed and untreated. And there's also a lot more research to do around other mental health issues for older people. This is especially significant given that there are more than 900 million older people in the world currently, and this number is going to more than double to 2 billion by 2050. So my question is, how can we ensure that older women and men are included in efforts to promote mental health and well-being and in that education, and also ensure they're counted in the monitoring of the NCD's target, particularly in relation to mental health?
Great, thank you. And then there's one question right here.
Thank you. Mandy Stevens, I'm Director of Mental Health in London. I really liked, Dixon, what you were saying about tolerant communities in sub-Saharan Africa and about how the communities look after people. That's something that has really stood out for me. One of the challenges that I've seen is that when people go to access care, firstly, it's very, very difficult to get hold of people. As you say, it's a very small ratio, 1 to 1 million. But also the issue about regulation of people, regulation of healthcare institutions, regulation of education institutions, and regulation of medication. So if you can't get access to mental health care, and if you do then get a prescription, you're then potentially picking up medication that is just going to be chalk anyway. So it's one of the big challenges, I think, is about regulating health services and healthcare. But also, I've seen people working with the Mental Health Gap Action Plan in low and middle income countries and how that works. And it's very much a bottom-up approach. It's about empowering community leaders and primary, secondary and tertiary healthcare workers in basic healthcare awareness, diagnosis and talking therapy, which is absolutely brilliant, really what is needed. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And then one question in the front here.
Silvia Stefanoni, independent consultant on aging, global aging. Obviously, I won't give the figures on the growth of mental health issues with population aging being a global, because they've already been given. But one thing I think is missing a little bit from the conversation is also when we're looking at the issue of what's the economic argument for this, is really understanding the care issues. I mean, the care issue is a massive issue of cost, and when we're looking at loss of productivity, we really need not to restrict ourselves to loss of work hours. We know there is again, Age UK was just recently talking about the number of older people over 80s that in the UK are carers, for example. But globally, it's an issue that needs to be, we need to understand the economic argument of care.
Great, thank you very much. And I'll take one last question just here.
Claire Grant from Christian Aid. I'm quite conscious of the fact that when we talk about mental health in developing and in humanitarian contexts, that we actually use the term mental health and psychosocial support. And in fact, the Interagency Standing Committee has guidelines which very much emphasises that it's a continuum. And I know the WHO, leading UN agencies and INGOs have contributed to those standards. And what I'd like to ask is, has the psychosocial side of things also been taken into consideration with some of these figures that we've been producing? I think particularly when we think about the aspect of cost and we look at whether actually it's culturally appropriate to transfer our medical approaches that are often Western into the context that we work in displacement, in refugee situations. I think that we do really need to ask ourselves questions that, do our models here translate effectively? And how do we make the most of mitigating some of the risks by actually looking more at these community-based models, which many researchers have pointed out have been much more effective?
Okay, Jessica, do you maybe want to start with that, and then we work backwards to the demographic questions?
Great. It was Claire, wasn't it? Yes. I think that's a great point, and the report actually talks a little bit about mental health and psychosocial services in humanitarian contexts. I appreciate that it is a continuum. We work largely with the WHO in understanding what would be best, and the report steers quite clear of not talking about types of treatment. It did that consciously. It looked at how much would be needed as a bare minimum to meet the gap based on best estimates. So absolutely, if we're looking at what's more culturally appropriate and different models, and that's where MHGAP I think is really useful, because it goes in and it works with non-trained psychiatrists and non-specialists to be able to be a first port of call for diagnosis. You're working from the grassroots up. But if we're going to do tailored solutions that are more culturally appropriate and representative of what's locally practiced, then we need to be looking at even higher costs. We're talking about just the bare minimum now, looking at what we have as a best guess. So I think those figures, they don't take into account what you're asking, but it would be higher if they did, is my short answer. But I might also defer to Dan, if he wants to comment on this as well, from the WHO's perspective. Is that all right, Dan?
I can say something.
Use the mic, say into the microphone then.
So, yeah, it's a tricky issue. What I was going to say was for some of these countries which have been through, like the Ebola-affected countries, there is huge opportunities to so-called build back better. So opportunities, however tragic they are, present themselves. And it's another example, if you like, of integration, of how you can integrate mental health into existing programmatic needs. And that's the opportunity to contextualize the program according to what is acceptable, what is feasible, what is affordable. Mental health services do not need to be expensive. And obviously, most low-income countries are very constrained in what they can do. So often, when you actually sit down and ask the likes of yourself, sir, what are your priorities? They will say, we need to look at X, Y, and Z conditions. And so that's what you work with. In emergency situations, we know there's a huge spike in, for example, the incidence of anxiety and depressive disorders, PTSD, and so on. So you therefore need to contextualize the program accordingly to meet those needs, but not forgetting that there are people with psychosis who may have had their previous needs very badly neglected. So this is this point about being somewhat opportunistic when such opportunities arise.
Alistair, do you want to come in on I mean, maybe from a UK perspective, the degree to which it's been possible to sort of bringing the ageing aspect of the problem? Because, from a development point of view, that if you look at just basic global demographics, we've got this huge increase in the elderly population in Latin America, East Asia, South Asia. It's clearly going to have a big bearing, but I just wonder what the lessons are from the UK.
It's really, I find this really tricky because I actually think the organisations that have been looking and campaigning, particularly on Alzheimer's dementia, have done a really, really good job. And I'm going to sound a bit harsh here, but I tend not to focus on them in terms of the campaigning space that I do, because I think that we're, when I say we, I mean the kind of, the general mental health awareness, I think we're well behind. But at some point, I mean, and the reason I say I think that sounds harsh, it's almost like I deliberately don't talk about those issues in this space because I think that they're doing such a good job strategically with government. Whereas, for example, adolescent and youth services are not. General levels of psychiatric development, training and support are not. And so, but I think at some point, it needs to all be brought in together. Now, I don't know whether that presents challenges to you, whether you feel a kind of reverse of the difficulty that I feel on this. But I think I don't think we've yet worked through, certainly at government level, and the point on productivity, I think you're excluding large numbers of, if you are just focusing on productivity, and I was the one who said you've got to make an economic case. As you do that, there is a danger that you're actually excluding potentially millions of people now and in the future. But you do, from a campaigning strategic point of view, you do weaken your argument by doing that. So I sort of feel, I feel for the moment we are better off seeing these as separate things. Does that make sense?
Dixon, what about from in a Zimbabwean context? Because I guess the issues are slightly. I mean, obviously the context is very different, but also the type of issues that you might be focusing on with a more elderly population would be different. But say in your work, how prominently does work with the elderly figure?
So, it's amazing how you have this trickle-down effect, when you have this as, I totally agree with Alistair, there's a lot more going on when you look at Alzheimer's in our country, as well as autism, for instance. There's so much going in those conditions, research-wise and funding-wise. And so, you have so many people coming in, specifically focusing on Alzheimer's, like it's the only condition, and dementia, So I'm not particularly involved in that, but there are quite a number of external organizations that actually come in regularly to specifically focus on these conditions in Zimbabwe.
Okay. Can I ask Dixon something? Do you mind? No, please. Well, I'm just fascinated by what it's like doing what you're doing in a country with, I mean, I'll be as diplomatic as I can, but I mean, I've met Mugabe, and I think he's like, I can't imagine having a conversation with him about better mental health care. So what's that?
Well, I haven't met him, so you're obviously ahead of the game.
But what's it like from the top level of government?
Well, this is why
do they take it seriously?
Well, the Minister of Health does take it seriously because he has, I think, people who are close to him who are living with mental health issues. but we don't normally go as far as as Mugabe's office to get what we want, because that's not usually possible anyway, you know. But I think at community level, as I keep emphasizing, you have community leaders, you have the heroes in those small groups, in those communities that actually can make things happen. And I think it's one way of really getting things done.
So it's almost like they're doing it despite the government.
Yeah.
But my guess is that that wouldn't be an untypical picture in Africa, no?
No.
I mean, we have a question from somebody from the Carter Centre on South Sudan, actually, where there's clearly a huge need for psychosocial counselling and support, and making the point that the health sector, the whole health budget, is 1% of the government budget, with almost no provision for mental health. You know, which I think speaks to the issue of political leadership in a way that you do wonder, unless you can shift the needle at the top, you know, whether the sort of community initiatives that you and others are leading can really work. Look, we do have to move towards a close, and I did want to give everybody on the panel a chance to just offer any final reflections on the discussion and thoughts. So if I could start on this side and work across.
Well, very quickly, first of all, I wanted to acknowledge the work that Qatar Foundation is doing in especially Liberia, and we're trying to get them into Sierra Leone. I don't know if they're in the room, but they're doing a fantastic job. And to say that I've learned something today from Alistair: keep talking, don't stop, keep pushing. At the point where you want to get tired, your answer is on the horizon. Thank you very much, Alistair. I will take that with me, you know. And just to really thank Jessica for this. This is fantastic. And to inform all of you that this report is also going to be launched in Sierra Leone, and Jessica is going to be part of it, and you're all welcome to come to Sierra Leone to launch this. Thank you.
Thank you.
To be part of that would be great.
Jessica.
Last reflections. I just wanted to add slightly to Valentina's question and the discussion on multiple facets of mental health, and I refer to it in the report as bidirectionality. And it's sort of the same argument you use for donors and development agencies, and how you fold mental health into not just being its own program within health, but you look at natural links like agriculture with suicide, debt and depression, climate change and mental health resilience, maternal and newborn and child health with maternal depression. So I think there's a huge case to be made there, and I think that part of the problem is that I know that you should never say that at the end of a report there's more research that needs doing, but I think this is one of those very valid areas where unfortunately we just don't have enough of an evidence base, and we haven't got enough funding going to the sector so that we can, so we have this catch-22. But I think that hopefully we're at the start of changing that. And I wanted to reflect on the fantastic variety of questions today and the leadership of the panel. It's great to see just so many people coming from so far away to talk about what is hopefully an issue that will go on to be talked about.
Thanks, Jessica. Dixon?
So I think in the short term, what's likely to contribute towards truly reducing this treatment gap for mental, neurological and substance use disorders, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, will be the integration of mental health into existing programs. So quote unquote into the so-called sexy programs, maternal and child health care, HIV, AIDS, malaria. And I think this is where we need to be going in the short term. And in the long term, we can obviously advocate for coming up with separate budget lines for mental health. So I think in a nutshell, that's what I think we should be doing.
Thanks, Dixon. Alistair?
I think the sort of final thought I throw in, which just take it to a slightly different place, is that you're all kind of experts and this is your world and this is what you know about. But I think when you're trying to mobilise political and public opinion to change, and to change the way that they think about things, don't underestimate what I call the kind of cultural space. In fact, I'm going to a thing tonight, the launch of an art exhibition all about depression. It's a depressive artist who's done 20 portraits of depressed people. And it sounds quite depressing, but I know he's done one of me and I've seen it and it's really depressing. But it's I think that whole thing, I was at a thing at Channel 4 last night for Mental Health Awareness Week. and there was a woman from Mind there who was saying that she's now advised soap operas on 70 different storylines, getting people with mental health problems, challenges into the soaps. Very few people who watch Emmerdale or Coronation Street or EastEnders every night, Jessica, very few are going to read every word of this. They're going to maybe just have a look at it. They might read that one. But what they will do, if they see, whether it's somebody with schizophrenia or OCD or whatever it might be, that if they see that person in a dramatic setting, that can change the way that they think about it. It can help them identify with people that they know. And I think that is all part of this. So I see this kind of thing as being at the top level of strategic engagement, but actually it's got to operate, it's got to go down through all levels. And that's why I spend so much time now, writing and speaking and broadcasting about this, because I think actually this cultural space is really, really important, and it's part of the never stop talking, never stop communicating.
Great, Alistair. Thank you so much. I think it's supposed to be my job to try and summarise the discussion, but I'm going to duck that one. I maybe just to make a few points that, it seems to me there are 3 or 4 areas that are absolutely fundamental to what we're trying to achieve here. The first is partly about history and social and cultural attitudes. There's a wonderful Radio 4 program called In Our Time, and a little while ago they got a group of 3 experts together to talk about Bedlam, which is just it was an institution just down the road from here, where people with mental health issues were essentially locked up, tormented. People were paid to go and look at them, and this sort of thing. But they made the connection with the links between mental health and stigma and control. Social, that the mental health domain is very different than the public health domain in the way that it's evolved. And to give a modern slant on it, I'm very struck by, I think everyone in this room has probably either dealt with mental health issues or had a friend or a relative who's dealt with mental health issues. But I'm really struck with being director here, that people will readily call you to explain why they can't be in the office because they've had to visit the doctor, because their son banged their head. They find it very, very difficult to do it over an issue, my son or daughter or relative has an eating disorder, or I'm deeply depressed today. And it does seem to me that meetings like this, where these issues are just discussed much more openly in the appropriate cultural context, are absolutely fundamental. And I think we have a role in ODI to helping support and facilitate that. I do think the point that all of you have made, and Alistair, you really stressed this on, somehow we have to translate this problem into a practical agenda for change. And, my sense, I've never worked in government in the way that you have, but the last thing a minister, let alone a prime minister or a finance minister, wants to hear is another story about a bunch of complicated problems. They want to hear about a problem that has a solution that is politically sellable. And around which a community can be mobilised and coalitions can be engaged with. And I think at the moment we have the individual parts of a coalition, but we don't have the coalition itself that we need. And I hope out of today's meeting we can start addressing that and developing the narrative. And I know all of these issues are different, but I have been struck by, if you think of the climate change issue, that 3 years ago, the only debate that you had about climate change with North-South negotiations was a sort of standoff. Rich countries think you need to do this, poor countries say, well, you cause the problem, we're not going to do it. Now, that dialogue has completely changed in the last year or so, and I think it's changed because people have crunched the cost-benefit numbers and essentially developed a narrative which says it doesn't matter who's responsible for the problem, but if you don't make these investments now, you're going to lose growth and you're going to lose jobs in the future. And it doesn't matter if you're the United States or China or India. And I think this was reflected in the Paris climate talks, actually, that it was a much more conducive environment, using a positive language rather than a negative language. And so, maybe there's something to be learnt from that. I think the point that all of you have made, that, and I'll use the words Arsene Wenger in this context, the vertical versus horizontal thing, that, we've come out of a long period, I think, where it's all been too vertical. We have a special fund for HIV/AIDS, a special fund for tuberculosis, we have a special set of initiatives for child survival, another set for nutrition. And I think that what we've discovered now, we're sort of running up against the buffers of how far you can go with that. That you basically, you can't do effective anti-malnutrition strategies unless you've got a functioning health system. You can't advance child survival among the most marginalised unless you've got an integrated health system. And I think the point that all of you have made is that we need to make sure that mental health is part of that integrated system. And we need some tough dialogue with donors on this as well, I think. I'd be really interested to understand. I'm not sure if we have people here from DFID today. Hi, well, you're very, very welcome. But I think it's an interesting, it'd be very good to hear from you the sort of challenges that you face within DFID of getting the Secretary of State to take this issue on board and mobilising the resources and so on. So I just want to conclude by saying this has genuinely been one of the best events I've been at in ODI in the last 3 years. And I really appreciate that all of you being here, making such fantastic contributions to Fode, to Jessica, to Dixon, and to Alistair. So a big thank you to all of you. It's sometimes argued there's no free lunch in development, but in ODI we seek to disprove these received wisdoms, and there will be a free lunch outside, where you can also pick up a copy of Alistair's book that I mentioned earlier. So thank you to all the speakers, and thank you to all of you for a really fantastic debate.